Preston Whitmore reached across the altar and straightened Madeline Carter's veil with the same careful hands that had once brushed the hair from Evelyn's face on a Tuesday morning when she had a fever and couldn't get out of bed. That was the moment Evelyn understood. Not when she'd received the invitation. Not when she'd seen her sister's name printed beside his. Not even when she'd walked into the church and heard the organ play. It was that small, practiced gesture, so intimate, so automatic, that told her this hadn't started yesterday. This had been going on for a long time. She stood in the back of the church in a gray dress she'd bought 3 days ago because nothing in her closet felt right anymore. And she watched the man she had loved for 6 years touch her younger sister's face like he'd been doing it in secret for God knows how long. The pews were full of Boston's finest, people she'd attended dinner parties with, people who had smiled at her from across tables, asked about her work, called her by her first name. Not one of them turned around. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who used to see you and realized you'd already become invisible, stay with me, because this story is for you. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment right now telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that church. Evelyn Carter was 34 years old and had spent the last decade building a career in legal research that most people in her field quietly envied and publicly ignored. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. She worked in a corner office on the 7th floor of a firm that paid her well and promoted her slowly and occasionally forgot to invite her to lunch. She had a 1-bedroom apartment in Cambridge with good windows and too many books, a coffee maker she'd owned since graduate school, and a cat named Morris, who was indifferent to her the way only cats and ex-boyfriends can be. She had Preston. For 6 years she had Preston Whitmore, whose family had been Boston money for 3 generations, who wore his wealth the way some people wear old sweaters, casually and without thinking about it, who had walked into her life at a charity auction she'd attended alone and said, "You look like you're calculating an exit strategy," and she'd laughed before she could stop herself. He wasn't the most emotionally available man she'd ever dated. She knew that early. He had a habit of going quiet at precisely the wrong moments, of turning conversations about feelings into discussions about logistics, of saying "I love you" most convincingly when they were in public and least convincingly when they were alone. But she'd told herself that was just how some men were built, that consistency was its own kind of love, that showing up, paying attention, choosing someone day after day, that counted. She'd been wrong about a lot of things. She found out about the wedding the way people find out about most devastating things, by accident. An email meant for a different Evelyn, forwarded by mistake from Preston's assistant. She'd stared at the subject line for 4 full minutes before she opened it. The details were already confirmed. The venue, the florist, the guest list. Her own name was not on it. She'd called Preston. He hadn't answered. She'd called 3 more times. He'd finally picked up on the 4th and said, in a voice that was almost steady, "I should have told you sooner." That was all the explanation she got. She should not have gone to the church. She knew that while she was getting dressed. She knew it when she called a car. She knew it the entire 20-minute drive, sitting in the back seat watching her own reflection in the rain-streaked window. But something in her, the part that had loved him seriously, the part that had built a future in her mind with his name in it, needed to see it with her own eyes. Needed the confirmation to be physical and undeniable, not just a forwarded email and 4 words over a telephone. So she went. The church was St. Sebastian's on Beacon Hill. Of course it was. The Whitmore family had been attending that church for 50 years. Preston's grandmother was buried in the churchyard. The stone steps were flanked by white roses, and the doors were propped open, and the music was already playing when Evelyn arrived and slipped inside and stood at the very back, half hidden behind a pillar, and looked up at the altar. And there was Madeline. Her sister was 28, 6 years younger, 3 inches taller, and possessed of a social ease that Evelyn had always quietly marveled at and never quite managed to replicate. Madeline had their mother's eyes and their father's confidence and a laugh that filled rooms in a way Evelyn's never had. They had not been close in the way sisters in movies are close. They were civil. They called on birthdays. They attended the same family dinners and talked around each other in the practiced way of people who share blood but not much else. Or so Evelyn had believed. Standing at the back of St. Sebastian's, watching Preston take Madeline's hands at the altar, Evelyn understood that she had been watching the wrong story entirely. She'd thought she was the main character in her own relationship. Turned out she'd been a placeholder. The veil adjustment. That was what finished her. Preston reached up with both hands, careful and sure, and straightened the lace at Madeline's temple. Madeline looked up at him with an expression that Evelyn recognized. Open, trusting, privately delighted. And something in Evelyn's chest cracked at a molecular level. She didn't cry. Not then. She couldn't. The grief was too large and too sudden, and it pressed against the inside of her ribs like something that needed more room than she had to give it. She turned around and walked back out the door. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called after her. Two women near the front who'd seen her enter. Women she'd met at the Whitmore 4th of July party 2 years ago. Women who'd asked for her card. Turned back to the altar without a word. She walked down the stone steps in the rain. She hadn't thought to bring an umbrella. The April storm had been forecast since yesterday, and she'd known it and walked out of her apartment without one anyway, which felt, in this moment, like a small and perfect metaphor for her entire adult life. The street outside the church was mostly empty. A few black cars idling at the curb, valets in white jackets standing under the awning of the reception venue next door, already arranging themselves for the evening crowd. Evelyn walked past all of it. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to be moving, needed the cold air and the rain and the sound of her own footsteps doing something purposeful, even if the purpose was simply escape. She ended up at the harbor. It was a 12-minute walk from St. Sebastian's, and she made it in 9, and by the time she reached the water, she was soaked through, the gray dress clinging to her arms, her hair flattened against her forehead, rain running down the back of her neck. She stood at the railing above the dark water and put both hands on the cold iron and just breathed. The harbor smelled like salt and diesel and something she couldn't name, something ancient and indifferent, like the ocean really didn't care what happened to her, which was almost comforting in its honesty. She thought about the last 6 years in pieces. The first apartment they'd shared briefly when they were figuring out what they were. The way Preston took his coffee. Black, too hot, too fast, burning his mouth every single time and never changing. The fight they'd had in December about whose family to spend Christmas with, which she'd thought at the time was a fight about logistics, but now understood was a fight about whether he ever intended to choose her. The way Madeline had visited for Thanksgiving 18 months ago and stayed for 5 days and was warm and charming and helpful in the kitchen and hugged Preston goodbye at the door. 5 days. Evelyn gripped the railing harder. She was so deep inside her own head that she didn't hear the car stop behind her, didn't hear the door open, didn't register anything until a black coat, heavy wool, warm, smelling faintly of something expensive and unidentifiable, settled over her shoulders from behind. She spun around. The man standing in front of her was not someone she'd seen before, and she would have remembered. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, not conventionally handsome in the Preston Whitmore sense of square jaw and good breeding, but the kind of man who occupied space with a density that made the air around him feel different. Dark eyes. Gray at the temples. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had not been bought off a rack, and he was now standing in the rain without his coat, watching her with an expression that was not pity and not curiosity, and not the particular brand of cautious male interest she'd learned to identify and deflect. It was something else. Assessment, maybe. The kind of attention you'd pay to something that surprised you. Behind him, a black sedan sat at the curb with the engine running. The driver didn't look back. "You're going to get sick," the man said. His voice was lower than she expected, unhurried, the voice of someone who'd learned a long time ago that raising it was unnecessary. "I'm fine," Evelyn said, which was the least accurate sentence she had ever spoken. He looked at her for a moment, at the soaked dress, the ruined hair, the iron grip on the railing, and said nothing. He didn't call her on it. He just stood there in the rain getting wet while she wore his coat, and the silence between them was strangely not uncomfortable. "That's Dominic Ashford's car," someone said behind her. She turned. A man in a valet uniform had stepped out from under the awning further up the block and was murmuring urgently to his colleague. Both of them were staring at the sedan. The name meant something. Evelyn was a legal researcher. She knew names. Dominic Ashford had come across her desk twice in the last 3 years. Once in connection with a federal case her firm had adjacent involvement in, once in a newspaper article about a waterfront development deal that certain city council members had been suspiciously enthusiastic about. The Ashford family had been in Boston for nearly as long as the Whitmores, but in a completely different direction. Old money in the Whitmore sense meant prep school and regatta season and country club memberships. Old money in the Ashford sense meant something murkier, longer rooted, and considerably more dangerous. She looked back at him. "You're Dominic Ashford," she said. "Yes. I know who you are." "Most people do," he said, without any particular pride or discomfort. "Just fact." "Then you'll understand why I'm not in the mood for whatever this is." She meant to hand his coat back. She started to take it off. The rain hit her shoulders immediately, and she stopped. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. "Keep it," he said. "I have others." She kept it. She didn't know why she stayed at the railing instead of walking away. She was cold and embarrassed and grieving in that raw, stupid way that doesn't leave room for dignity. And the sensible thing would have been to call a car and go home and sit with Morris and be furious in private. But there was something about the way this man stood in the rain without apparent concern for his suit or his schedule or the spectacle of it that made her not comfortable exactly, but less alone. "You came from St. Sebastian's," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "The Whitmore wedding." She looked at him sharply. "You know them?" "I know everyone in this city." He paused. "I also know that the man marrying Evelyn Carter was engaged to her sister until about 3 months ago." The words landed without softening. Evelyn felt them in her sternum. 3 months, she repeated, give or take. "The invitations went out 6 weeks ago." "Yes." He let that sit there. Let her do the arithmetic on what it meant. That the engagement had been broken, that the wedding had been planned, that the invitations had been sent, that all of this had happened in an overlap that meant the ending of her relationship and the beginning of theirs weren't as sequential as she'd been led to believe. The rain came harder. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Dominic Ashford was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the harbor the way people look at large bodies of water when they're choosing their words carefully. "Because someone should," he said. She didn't have an answer to that. She turned back to the water. Behind her, she heard him, not leaving, not coming closer, just present, the way a person can be present without making demands of the space. "I have a proposal for you," he said, after a while. She almost laughed. "I'm not in this market." "Not that kind." He was quiet again. Then, "I need a wife. You need a reason to walk back into that ballroom tonight and not feel like the woman they discarded. Those two things aren't unrelated." She turned around slowly. He was watching her with the same steady attention as before, rain running down the side of his face, suit jacket soaked through the shoulders now, and he looked completely unbothered by all of it. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be reassuring," he said. "It was meant to be honest." She stared at him. The harbor wind was cold and the rain hadn't let up, and she was wearing a stranger's coat, and her sister was at this moment probably dancing with the man Evelyn had spent 6 years building a life with. And Dominic Ashford was standing in front of her offering something that made no sense and every kind of terrible sense simultaneously. "Tell me what you mean," she said. "All of it. What you actually mean." He looked at her for a long moment. "Not here," he said. "You need to get warm first. Then we can talk." She should have said no. Every reasonable, self-protective instinct she possessed told her to say no. To hand back his coat and walk away and process this night alone the way she processed everything. Quietly, systematically, without asking anyone for anything. Instead, she heard herself say, "Where?" And Dominic Ashford nodded once and turned back toward the sedan and held the door. Evelyn stood in the rain for another 3 seconds. She looked back at the harbor one more time, at the dark water, the lights of the far shore blurring through the weather, the city that had just watched her get replaced without blinking. Then she walked to the car. The car was warm. That was the first thing. Evelyn hadn't realized how cold she'd gotten until the door closed behind her, and the heat from the vents touched the side of her face, and her hands started to shake. Not from fear. From the body finally being allowed to react to 40 minutes of standing in April rain without a coat. She pressed her fingers flat against her thighs to stop it and stared straight ahead at the partition between the passenger cabin and the driver. Dominic got in on the other side. He didn't look at her immediately. He said something to the driver in a low voice. 2 words, maybe 3, and the car pulled away from the curb smoothly, like it had been waiting for exactly this and nothing else. "Where are we going?" Evelyn said. "Somewhere with towels and a working fireplace." "That's not an address." "No," he agreed. She looked at him. He was looking out his window at the rain-blurred street, and she had a moment to study his profile without him knowing. The slight tension in his jaw, the line of his shoulders, the way he held his hands loose in his lap, like a man who had trained himself out of fidgeting a long time ago. He looked like someone who had learned stillness the hard way. "You said you'd explain," she said. "I will. I'd like to start now." He turned from the window and looked at her with that same unhurried attention. "You're still shaking." "I'm aware." "Then let me rephrase. You'll hear it better when you're not hypothermic." It was not said unkindly. That was the thing she kept bumping against, the absence of condescension in his voice. He wasn't managing her. He wasn't performing patience. He was just stating what he observed, the way someone states the weather. She looked away first. The car took the bridge north, away from Beacon Hill, away from St. Sebastian's and the reception venue, and all of it. The city thinned on either side of them. The rain followed. Evelyn sat with Preston's face in her mind. That moment at the altar, hands on the veil, and tried to locate something useful inside the wreckage of the last 3 hours. Anger would have been useful. Anger was clean and gave you direction. What she had instead was something more diffuse, a kind of stunned exhaustion, like her entire nervous system had overloaded and tripped its own breaker. She felt hollow. Carefully, precisely, hollow. She noticed she was still wearing Dominic Ashford's coat. The estate was 40 minutes north of the city, set back from the coastal road, behind an iron gate that opened without the car slowing down. The driveway was long, and the grounds on either side of it were dark in the rain, but she could see the shapes of trees and something like a garden wall, and then the house itself. Not a mansion in the showy sense, not the kind of thing Preston's family built to be photographed. It was large and old and serious, stone and dark timber, the kind of structure that said, "We have been here a long time and intend to remain." A woman was waiting at the front door. Late 60s, gray hair pulled back, the build of someone who'd spent decades on her feet. She didn't look surprised to see Evelyn. She didn't look anything in particular. She simply stepped aside and said, "The blue room's ready." And that was that. "This is Margaret," Dominic said. "She's run this house for 23 years. 24, Margaret said, already walking. Evelyn followed her up a staircase that smelled like old wood and something floral she couldn't identify. The blue room turned out to be exactly that. A bedroom with walls the color of a deep winter sky, a fireplace that was already going, and a bathroom attached where towels had been set out that were thicker than anything Evelyn owned. "There are dry clothes in the wardrobe," Margaret said from the doorway. "Nothing fancy, practical." "Thank you," Evelyn said. Margaret looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not warm, exactly. Not cold. Measured. Like she was seeing something and filing it away. "He doesn't bring people here," Margaret said. Then she pulled the door closed. Evelyn stood alone in the blue room for a full minute before she moved. She peeled off the gray dress and hung it over the radiator. She stood under the hottest shower she could tolerate until the shaking stopped, and her fingers stopped feeling like they belonged to someone else. She put on the clothes from the wardrobe, dark trousers, a cream-colored sweater that was too large in the shoulders, wool socks. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and thought, "You don't look like someone who just watched her sister marry her ex-fiancé. You look like someone who borrowed someone else's life by accident," which, she supposed, was close enough to accurate. Dominic was in the study on the ground floor when she came back down. The room was book-heavy and firelit and smelled like coffee and something she eventually identified as gun oil, faint, almost beneath detection, but there. He was standing at the window with his back to her and a cup in his hand, still in his suit, but without the jacket now, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He heard her come in and turned around. "Better," he said, marginally. She looked at the chair nearest the fire and sat in it without being invited. "Talk." He sat across from her, put his cup on the table, looked at her with that steadiness she was beginning to think might just be his face's default setting. "I've been a widower for 4 years," he said. "My wife's name was Catherine. She died of a brain aneurysm in the kitchen of this house on a Thursday morning in November. She was 41. He said it flatly, without the particular cadence of someone performing grief, which meant the grief was real and old, and had been compressed into something manageable. Before she died, she was the reason a significant number of people in this city took me seriously outside of the circles I was born into, not because of anything she performed, because of who she was. Evelyn waited. I run a family organization, he said. I think you know what that means. I've read enough federal case files to have a working definition. Then I won't dress it up. The Ashford family has been operating in New England for 60 years. I inherited it at 32 when my father had a stroke. I've spent the last 12 years converting as much of it as possible into legitimate enterprise, real estate, logistics, private security contracting, a shipping concern up the coast. We still have aspects that wouldn't survive a close look from the right federal prosecutor. He met her eyes. I'm telling you this because you said you'd researched me, and because I'd rather you know what you're considering than agree to something you don't understand. I haven't agreed to anything. No, he said. You haven't. She looked at the fire. You said you need a wife. I need a particular kind of wife. There are factions within my own organization that have spent the last 3 years interpreting my restraint as weakness, my refusal to authorize certain operations, my movement toward legitimate business. They read it as softness. Catherine's death removed a stabilizing factor I hadn't fully understood while she was alive. I was precise about it, analytical, but not without feeling. She could hear that he'd thought about this many times in many different ways and had arrived at honesty as the most efficient option. A wife who is clearly her own person, educated, professionally established, not dependent on me for identity or income, communicates something specific to the people I need to communicate it to. It says the man at the top has not become sentimental or easily managed. It says he chose carefully, that he still chooses carefully. You want a symbol, Evelyn said. I want a partner. The symbolic value is a side effect. A partner in what exactly? In being seen, in attending the right events and handling the right rooms and not flinching when someone says something designed to test you. You'd have complete independence in your professional life. No interference, no requests, no obligation to perform anything beyond what we'd agree to in a contract. A contract, she repeated. Yes. She looked at him fully. You're describing a business arrangement. To start. And what does it become? He held her gaze. I don't know. I'd rather not speculate about that in advance. It was the most honest thing he'd said, which somehow made it the most unsettling. She stood up, walked to the window because she needed to be moving. Outside, the rain had eased slightly. She could see the dark shape of what might be a garden wall, a stone path going somewhere, the faint line of the ocean beyond it all. Preston knew about you, she said to the window. The timing you mentioned, 3 months. He ended our engagement 3 months ago and didn't tell me until last week. That means while he was ending us, the wedding was already being planned. Yes. Why? Dominic was quiet for a moment. She heard him shift in the chair. That's the part I'd let you discover on your own. She turned around. Don't do that. He looked at her steadily. The Whitmore family has been under federal financial surveillance for 14 months. Their primary assets are significantly overvalued. There are investors, quiet ones, old family money, who have been looking for a way to insulate themselves from the fallout. Madeline Carter's uncle, Gerald Carter, manages 3 of those investment accounts. Evelyn felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the weather. Gerald, she said softly. He came to every family Christmas. He brought the same wine every year. He asked about my work like he found it interesting. He finds your work professionally inconvenient, Dominic said. You're a legal researcher with access to federal case filing databases and the analytical capacity to connect things other people miss. An alliance between the Whitmore family and the Carter family through Madeline removes a potential liability, you. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Evelyn stood very still. She thought about the last 3 months, the slight cooling she'd attributed to stress, Preston's distracted quality at dinner, which she'd read as work pressure, the way he'd stopped asking about her cases. The 2 times she'd mentioned the Whitmore name in the context of adjacent federal proceedings, and he'd changed the subject. He hadn't gotten tired of her. He'd been afraid of her. He threw me away, she said, because I might accidentally do my job too well. Dominic didn't soften it. That's my read. She turned back to the window. The ocean was barely visible now, just a dark suggestion beyond the wall, But she fixed her eyes on it because she needed something that wasn't moving, and the room felt suddenly very small. She had loved Preston Whitmore for 6 years. She had reorganized her professional schedule around his family's summer house in Gloucester. She had smiled through 100 dinners with people who'd looked right through her because she'd believed she was building something that mattered. She had been, without knowing it, a piece on a board being moved by hands she couldn't see. The grief that came then was different from what she'd felt at the church. The church grief was the grief of loss. This was the grief of humiliation, the particular savagery of realizing you were never the point of your own story. She didn't cry. She pressed one hand against the window glass and felt the cold come through it, and breathed. "All right," she said. "All right, what?" She turned around. "Tell me what the contract looks like." Dominic studied her face for a moment. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy some internal assessment. He stood, went to the desk in the corner, and opened a drawer. He came back with a folded document, not fresh, not just printed, something that had been prepared. She looked at it, looked at him. "You had this ready." "I had it prepared as a possibility." "You knew I'd be at the church." "I knew you might be." He held it out. "Read it. Take as long as you need." She took it. She stood by the fire and read it the way she read everything professionally, line by line, twice, paying attention to what was included and what was conspicuously absent. It was thorough. Duration of arrangement, minimum 1 year, reviewed quarterly. Financial provisions that were more than fair. Professional autonomy clause that was more explicit than she'd expected. Mutual exit conditions. A single line near the bottom that she read 3 times. All parties enter this agreement with the understanding that the arrangement may develop in directions not anticipated at signing. She looked up. "This line?" "Yes." "It's not typical contract language." "No." "It's a hedge." "It's honesty," he said, with a quietness that didn't invite argument. She looked back at the document. She thought about her apartment in Cambridge with its good windows and its indifferent cat, and the 6 years of her life that had just been retroactively reclassified as collateral damage in someone else's financial strategy. She thought about walking back into that reception ballroom tomorrow, the second evening of the Whitmore wedding celebration, as the woman who hadn't been invited, as the woman who'd slipped out of the church in a wet dress, as the woman nobody had bothered to turn around for. She thought about the particular expression on Preston's face when he'd finally picked up her call, that almost steadiness, the voice of a man who'd already made peace with what he was doing to her and wanted it over quickly. She put the document on the mantel. "I need tonight," she said. "You have it. I'll give you my answer at 7 tomorrow morning." "That's fine." She looked at him. He was standing 6 feet away, firelight on one side of his face, and he looked like a man who was accustomed to waiting for things and didn't find it difficult. "Why me?" she said. "Specifically. You could have approached any number of women in this city, women who run in your world, women who already understand the rules." Dominic was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. "Because every woman in my world already knows what they'd be getting," he said. "And every one of them would come with their own agenda, their own family's interests, their own calculations. I watched you stand at a railing in the rain for 20 minutes and not ask anyone for a single thing." He looked back at her. "That's rarer than you'd think." She held his gaze. "That's not a complete answer," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He picked up his coffee cup from the table. "I'll have Margaret show you to your room. The blue one's already prepared." "I know. She already took me there." "Then good night, Miss Carter." She crossed the room toward the door. Her hand was on the frame when she stopped. "Evelyn," she said. "What?" She turned halfway. "If we're going to do this, and I haven't said yes yet, but if we are, it's Evelyn." He looked at her from across the study, firelight behind him. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. She went upstairs. She lay in the blue room with the fire burning low and the rain finally stopping outside, and her mind refusing to slow down. She ran the contract language through her head again from memory, the provisions, the exit clauses, the hedge at the end. She thought about Gerald Carter bringing the same wine to Christmas dinner for as long as she could remember. She thought about the way Preston had said, "I should have told you sooner." Not, "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong," and how that single grammatical choice now made complete terrible sense. He wasn't sorry. He was sorry about the timing. She thought about the look on Dominic Ashford's face when she'd asked why her specifically. She thought, "You are considering agreeing to marry a man you met 2 hours ago who runs a criminal organization and lives in a stone house by the ocean and speaks like someone who has seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it." She thought, "You are also a woman who spent 6 years building a life that turned out to be someone else's insurance policy." She thought, those two things might not be unrelated. At some point before midnight, the exhaustion caught up and she slept. And when she woke, it was 6:43 and pale light was coming through the curtains, and Margaret was already moving somewhere downstairs because she could hear footsteps with the particular purpose of someone who had been awake for hours. She sat up. She put her feet on the floor. She thought about it for exactly 4 more minutes, which was how long it took to acknowledge that her answer had already been decided somewhere around the 3rd hour of lying in the dark, and that what she'd called sleeping on it had actually been her mind running the numbers and arriving at a conclusion her conscious self was only now catching up to. She stood up. She found the dry clothes from the night before. She went downstairs. Dominic was in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, the kitchen, standing at the counter with coffee and the morning paper, jacket off, and he looked up when she came in without any particular surprise, like he'd expected her at roughly this time. She sat down across the counter. "Yes," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You've read the contract." "Twice. I want one modification." "Which?" "The professional autonomy clause. I want it broader. Not just no interference, no consultation requests, no referrals, no cases directed my way through intermediaries. My practice stays completely separate from anything connected to your organization. If I find out later that a client came to me through you, the contract voids." He considered this for about 4 seconds. "Done. In writing. I'll have it amended before we leave." She looked at him. "We're leaving today." "The reception is tonight." He poured a second cup of coffee and put it in front of her without asking how she took it. Black, it turned out. Which she did. "If you're going to walk back in there, it shouldn't be as a rumor. It should be as a fact." She wrapped both hands around the mug. The morning was gray through the kitchen window, the ocean visible now, flat and pewter, the kind of calm that comes after weather has exhausted itself. "Preston will be there," she said. "Yes." "Madeline will be there." "Yes." "Gerald Carter will be there." Dominic set his cup down. He looked at her with a directness that was neither reassuring nor cruel. "Gerald Carter will be there," he said, "and so will the 2 federal agents he doesn't know have been attending every Whitmore social function for the past 8 months. Evelyn's hands stilled around the cup. "What?" she said. "The investigation I mentioned. It's further along than the Whitmore family knows. Last night was a threshold event. Certain financial transactions cleared in a pattern that apparently means something significant to the people monitoring them." He held her gaze. "Tonight's reception may be the last social function Gerald Carter attends as a free man." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at the cup, then at the window, then back at Dominic Ashford, who was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had just handed a person something heavy and was making sure they didn't drop it. "You knew this last night," she said, "when you made the proposal." "I knew the investigation existed. I didn't know the timeline had accelerated." "But you knew tonight was significant." A pause. "Fractional." "Yes." She felt something shift inside her. Not anger, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The sensation of a floor that you thought was solid, developing a slight give. "Is that why you approached me?" she said. "Because of what happens tonight. Because of what it looks like if I'm there." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her at the harbor. That full, unhurried attention. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "I approached you," he said, "because of what I saw at that railing. Everything else is context." He picked up his cup. "But I won't tell you the context is irrelevant. That would be a lie, and I don't do that." Evelyn sat with it. The fire in the kitchen was smaller than the one in the study, but it was doing its job, and the coffee was good, and the morning light was coming through the window in that gray coastal way that makes everything look like a painting of itself. And she was sitting across a kitchen counter from a man who had told her more truth in 12 hours than the man she'd loved for 6 years had managed in 6 years. She put the cup down. "I want the amendment in writing before we sign," she said, And I want to be the one who decides when we enter that room tonight, not you. We go in when I say." Something in Dominic's face changed, small. The jaw eased a fraction of a degree. "Agreed," he said. She nodded once, picked up the coffee. Outside, the ocean sat flat and gray and patient, doing what oceans do, holding its depth below a surface that gave nothing away, waiting for someone to be foolish enough to assume that calm meant simple. Evelyn Carter had signed contracts before. She knew that the moment of signing was never the actual point of no return. The point of no return was always earlier, some quieter moment when a decision crystallized in the body before the mind caught up. For some people it was a conversation. For some it was a silence. For her, she understood now, it had been the moment she turned away from the harbor railing and walked toward the car. Everything after that was just paperwork. The stylist's name was Renata, and she worked in silence, which Evelyn appreciated. Margaret had arranged everything by 9 in the morning, a woman arriving at the estate with 2 cases and the particular efficiency of someone accustomed to making people presentable on short notice. She didn't ask questions. She looked at Evelyn once, walked a slow circle around her and said, "We'll go dark," something that doesn't apologize. And Evelyn said, "Fine," and sat down in the chair in front of the mirror in the blue room. She watched herself being worked on and tried not to think too hard about what she was preparing for. The contract had been amended and signed at 8:15 at the kitchen counter with 2 witnesses she didn't know, quiet men who materialized from somewhere in the house and disappeared again immediately after. The professional autonomy clause now ran to 3 paragraphs. Dominic had read her additions without comment and initialed each one. His handwriting was small and deliberate, the kind that suggested a person who chose what to commit to paper carefully. She'd kept her copy folded in the pocket of the trousers she'd worn to breakfast. When Renata arrived, she moved it to her bag. Outside the window, the day had gone from gray to a thin, washed-out blue. The ocean was visible, calm now, almost gentle, the way April coastal weather sometimes pivoted without warning after a storm. Evelyn kept looking at it between Renata's interventions and thinking about the last thing Dominic had said before she'd come back upstairs. "I won't tell you, the context is irrelevant. That would be a lie, and I don't do that." She'd been turning that sentence over since breakfast, not because it alarmed her, because it was so precisely calibrated. The acknowledgement of the context, the refusal to minimize it, the line held between honesty and manipulation. She had spent 6 years with the man who'd excelled at speaking in ways that felt honest without actually being so. She knew the difference between the 2 constructions. Dominic's version was different. She just hadn't yet determined how much different mattered. Renata finished at 11. She stepped back, looked at her work, made one small adjustment at the temple, and said, "There." She didn't show Evelyn the mirror with a flourish. She just started packing her cases. Evelyn looked at herself. She looked like someone else. Not in a costume sense, in the sense that the woman in the mirror had all of Evelyn's actual features, the dark eyes, and the slightly too strong jaw, and the 5'6" posture that had always read as more reserved than she intended, but composed differently, deliberate. The kind of face that walks into a room and doesn't immediately look for permission to be there. She thought, that is what it looks like when you stop waiting for people to see you. She held the thought for 3 seconds and then let it go, because sentiment was not something she could afford tonight. Dominic was in the entrance hall when she came down the stairs at 6:15. He was already dressed, a dark suit, white shirt, no tie, and he was talking to someone on the phone in a low voice, one hand in his pocket, facing the door. He heard her on the stairs and turned around. He looked at her. Nothing theatrical in it, but he went quiet for a moment, and the person on the phone said something he didn't answer right away. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, and hung up. Evelyn reached the bottom of the stairs. "Problem?" "No." He studied her with that assessment she was beginning to recognize. "You ready?" "Ready?" "I said I'd tell you when." "You did." She looked at the front door. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about Preston's face, Madeline's face, the 200 guests who had been present at St. Sebastian's yesterday and hadn't turned around. She thought about Gerald Carter's wine at Christmas dinner. "Now," she said. The drive back into the city was 40 minutes, and they spent most of it in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Evelyn sat with her bag in her lap and watched the coastal road give way to suburbs, give way to the denser geometry of Boston proper, And she ran through the evening the way she'd run through case strategy, entry, variables, probable reactions, pressure points. The federal agents Dominic had mentioned, the pattern of financial transactions he'd described, Gerald Carter, who would be in that ballroom not knowing a clock had already run out. "Tell me what to expect when we walk in," she said. "Silence first, then a lot of people trying to figure out what to do with their faces. I mean structurally, the room, where the family will be positioned." He glanced at her. "You're approaching it like a deposition." "I approach everything like a deposition." Something at the corner of his mouth. "The Whitmores will be at the family table on the east side of the room. Gerald Carter usually positions himself near the bar. He likes a fixed point. Preston and Madeline will be at the center table, first dance probably at 8. He paused. "The agents will be distributed. You won't recognize them unless you're looking for specific behavioral patterns." "What patterns?" "People who are watching everything except the people you'd expect them to watch." She filed it, looked back at the window. "Don't manage me tonight," she said. "Don't steer me or signal me or do anything that makes it look like I'm following your lead. I wasn't planning to. I'm saying it explicitly so we both know." "Understood." He looked at the road. "Same goes." She glanced at him. "Same goes what?" "Don't manage me. If something happens that I need to respond to, don't put your hand on my arm and give me a look. I'll handle what I need to handle." She considered this. "What might you need to handle?" "Hopefully nothing." He said it in a tone that meant possibly something. She let it sit. The reception venue was the Alderton Club on Commonwealth Avenue, a building that had been making Boston money feel comfortable about itself since 1887. The exterior was Georgian brick and brass fittings and window boxes that contained flowers, even in April, because the Alderton Club was the kind of place that paid someone to insure it. There were photographers on the steps and a line of black cars at the curb, and through the tall windows Evelyn could see the interior lit gold and crowded. The driver pulled to the front. Evelyn sat for one more moment. She looked at the entrance. She thought about the gray dress she'd worn yesterday, and the rain, and the harbor railing, and the particular quality of invisible that she'd felt walking back down those church steps. She thought about 6 years and one forwarded email, and 4 words over a telephone. She opened the door herself. The cold hit her, and she stood on the sidewalk outside the Alderton Club, and Dominic came around from his side and stood beside her, and he didn't offer his arm or his hand. He simply stood there, present, and waited. She put her hand in the crook of his arm. Her choice. "All right," she said. They went in. The ballroom was large and chandelier-lit and smelled like cut flowers and warmed champagne and 200 people's competing perfumes. The noise of it hit them at the door. That specific orchestrated din of Boston money socializing. And then something moved through the room the way a change in air pressure moves, invisible but felt, and the noise dropped. Not to silence, but close. Heads turned. The specific ripple of recognition that moves through a room when someone unexpected walks into it. And then the second ripple, slower and more complicated, as people identified Dominic Ashford and then looked at the woman beside him and tried to place her and couldn't. A photographer near the entrance raised a camera, lowered it, raised it again. Evelyn kept her chin level and walked into the room like she'd designed it herself. She spotted the family table first. 2 Whitmore aunts she'd met at a 4th of July function, a cousin she recalled being aggressively boring at Thanksgiving, Preston's mother Eleanor at the center, a tall woman of 63 who had always treated Evelyn with the specific warmth of someone who had not yet determined whether she was a permanent fixture worth investing in. Eleanor Whitmore was looking at her now with an expression that moved through several phases in rapid succession before settling, with visible effort, on composed. Then she found Preston. He was standing near the center table with a champagne glass in his hand, and Madeline at his side, and a smile on his face that belonged to a conversation he was no longer having because he'd stopped mid-sentence when he saw her. The glass didn't move. His mouth didn't close all the way. He looked like a man who had done a calculation he was absolutely certain about and was watching it come back wrong. Madeline saw her 3 seconds later. Whatever Evelyn had expected from her sister's face, it wasn't this. Not defiance, not guilt precisely, but something that looked like a collision of both. A face that had been prepared for a lot of scenarios tonight and had not prepared for this particular one. Madeline's eyes went to Dominic first, then back to Evelyn. Something in her color changed. Evelyn looked away from both of them, kept walking. Dominic moved beside her with the ease of a man who had entered rooms like this, rooms that rearranged themselves around his presence, many times before. He didn't perform it, he just walked, and the performance happened around him. A man intercepted them near the edge of the dance floor. Mid-50s, silver-haired, a face that had trained itself into permanent pleasantness. He put his hand out to Dominic with the particular confidence of someone who didn't expect rejection. "Dominic," the man said, "what a surprise. We didn't know you were acquainted with the families." "Gerald," Dominic said, and shook the hand with enough pressure to be neutral. "This is my wife, Evelyn." The sentence landed differently than she'd expected. Not because of the word, she'd known it was coming, but because of the quality of Dominic's voice when he said it. Unhurried, unperforming, like a statement of simple established fact. Gerald Carter turned to her, and she watched his face go through something that he managed very quickly and very nearly concealed: recognition. Not just recognition, categorization. His eyes moved over her face, and she saw him place her and then immediately restructure his expression into warmth, a fraction too late, a fraction too deliberate. "Evelyn," he said, "I didn't know." "It's recent," she said, and smiled at him with her mouth only. Gerald laughed. It was a good laugh, polished, the laugh of a man who had used it to fill awkward silences for 50 years. "Well, congratulations to you both. Wonderful to have you here." He moved his gaze back to Dominic. "We should catch up before the evening's out." "We should," Dominic said, in a tone that meant we won't. Gerald moved away. Evelyn tracked him with her peripheral vision, watched him cross the room at a pace that was almost but not quite too fast, watched him take out his phone and look at it, and put it away and take it out again. "He recognized me," she said quietly. "Yes," Dominic said. "He's worried." "He should be." She had time to think about that for approximately 90 seconds before she felt someone at her shoulder. "Evelyn." Preston's voice. She turned. He was close, closer than she'd expected, which meant he'd moved toward her deliberately, which meant he'd had time to compose himself and choose to approach. He was good-looking in the way she'd always thought he was. The square jaw and the easy shoulders, and the hair that never looked like he'd done anything to it, and he was looking at her with an expression she identified as control, a man running his own reaction in real time. "You're here," he said, the flatness of it, the "you're not supposed to be here" dressed as a statement. "I was invited," she said. "I imagine my name slipped through." His eyes went to Dominic beside her. She watched something move behind his face. She'd seen that particular motion before, years ago, when someone at a firm function had taken Preston's parking space and he'd smiled through it. That specific rearrangement of a man who had decided not to react, but whose face wasn't fully cooperating. "Dominic Ashford," Preston said. "Whitmore," Dominic said. No title, no warmth, no extension of a hand. The two of them looked at each other for exactly as long as necessary, and not a moment more. Evelyn observed the exchange with the detached clarity of someone watching a negotiation they didn't need to intervene in. Preston looked back at her. "Can we talk? For a minute?" "We are talking." "Alone?" "No," she said, simply, without heat. His jaw tightened. "Evelyn, there's nothing you need to say to me that can't be said here." She met his eyes. She kept her voice level and her posture easy, and she did not allow herself to feel, in this moment, a single one of the things she was actually feeling, because feeling them here would cost her this moment, and she was not willing to pay that. "I'm glad the day worked out for you, Preston. I hope the evening does too." She turned away from him. Her heart was going at twice its normal rate. She pressed her arm slightly into Dominic's, and he responded with the faint counterpressure of someone who felt it and acknowledged it without drawing attention to it. They moved toward the far side of the room. "You all right?" he said. Low. Meant only for her. "Yes," she said. It was still the least accurate sentence in the English language, but she was getting better at meaning it. They were 40 minutes into the reception when the room changed. Evelyn felt it before she saw it. The same pressure shift quality as their entrance, but different in character, sharper, moving from the main doors inward. She turned. 3 men had come through the entrance, dark jackets, the specific quality of purposeful movement that she recognized from depositions and federal courthouse corridors. They were followed by 2 more. One of them showed something to the door security, brief, efficient, and the security stepped aside without a word. The room noticed. It couldn't help but notice. The noise thinned again, differently this time. Not the social recalibration of before, but something with an edge in it, a held breath. Evelyn watched one of the agents. She was sure now, the behavioral pattern Dominic had described, watching the non-obvious things, cross the room toward the east side where Gerald Carter was standing with a group of 4 men she recognized as Whitmore business associates. Gerald saw them coming from 10 feet away. She could tell because his hand, which had been raising a glass, stopped. It stopped completely. The glass suspended at chest height. Then he put it down on the nearest surface and turned and walked in the other direction. And one of the agents adjusted course to follow him, and then 2 things happened simultaneously. Gerald reached for his phone, and the lead agent said something sharply and closed the distance in 3 steps. Evelyn was watching all of it with the lateral attention of someone who processes detail for a living, and she saw, in the same moment, Madeline across the room turn toward the commotion and then turn toward Evelyn, and their eyes met across 40 feet of chandelier light and ballroom distance. She had not looked at her sister directly until now. Madeline's face was not what she'd been bracing for, not guilt, not cunning, not the face of someone caught. It was the face of someone who had just understood something and found it terrible. Her mouth was slightly open. Her champagne glass was in both hands. She looked young in a way she hadn't looked yesterday at the altar, which was strange because today she was a married woman, and yesterday she'd been a bride. She looked, Evelyn realized, scared. The agents had Gerald Carter, who was not in handcuffs yet. They had him in a tight verbal exchange near the east wall, 2 agents bracketing him while a 3rd made a call. But the room had understood that this was not a social visit, and the noise had dropped to something barely above a murmur. 200 people in a string quartet in a silence you could almost press your hand against. Preston was moving. Evelyn tracked him. He'd left the center table and was cutting across the floor toward the east side, toward Gerald. And another agent stepped into his path and said something that stopped him cold. She watched Preston Whitmore stand in the center of a ballroom full of Boston's finest and understand in real time what was happening. His face did something she'd never seen it do in 6 years. It came apart. Just for a moment, 3, 4 seconds. And then he pulled it back, but she saw it. She had been close enough to that face for long enough to recognize the difference between performance and collapse. And that had been collapse. Dominic was at her shoulder. We should move toward the edge of the room. In a minute. Evelyn. 1 minute, she said without moving. She watched Gerald Carter finally be taken by the arm and walk toward the exit, and the room parted for it the way rooms part for something they can't look away from but also can't believe is happening. She watched 2 Whitmore cousins visibly consult each other in a corner. She watched Eleanor Whitmore's face go to stone, the specific stoniness of a woman who has spent decades maintaining a surface and is now maintaining it by sheer mechanical force. And she watched Madeline. Her sister had not moved from her spot near the center table. Preston had made it back to her side, no longer trying to get to Gerald, stopped by the agent, rerouted, and he was talking to Madeline in an urgent undertone with his hand on her arm, and Madeline was listening to him, but looking at Evelyn. Across the room, through 40 feet of chandelier light and stunned silence and the wreckage of whatever this evening was supposed to have been, looking at Evelyn like she was trying to say something that didn't have words yet. Evelyn held her gaze for exactly 5 seconds. Then she looked away. Dominic guided her toward the side corridor with a hand at the small of her back. Light, directional, not possessive. And she let herself be guided because the room had reached a pitch that didn't require her to stay in it anymore. The corridor was quieter, carpeted and wallpapered and lit by smaller, warmer lights than the ballroom, the sound from inside muffled to a low roar. They walked to an alcove near the cloakroom and stopped, and Evelyn put one hand on the wall and breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with something that was almost surprise. "Gerald Carter is being arrested," she said. Not a question, confirming the mechanics of what she'd watched. "Yes." "On what charges?" "Wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy to commit." Dominic leaned against the wall across from her with his arms crossed, watching her. "There are 11 counts filed. The threshold event I mentioned, the transactions that cleared yesterday, gave the prosecutors the final piece." "Yesterday," she said. while Preston and Madeline were getting married. Yes, she thought about this. About the specific cruelty of the timing, not deliberate on anyone's part, probably, just the indifferent machinery of federal investigation moving at its own pace. Gerald Carter had spent months constructing an alliance designed to protect himself from exactly this, and it had run out one day too late. "What does this mean for the Whitmore money?" she said. "Significantly complicated. Gerald managed accounts for 6 Whitmore family trusts. The assets under investigation will be frozen pending discovery. It'll take years to sort, and some portion of it won't come back." Dominic paused. Preston married into a family whose financial firewall just got arrested. She let out a breath. Not a laugh. Not quite. "He traded me for a burning building." "He did." She straightened up from the wall. She looked at the floor for a moment, running the numbers the way she would for any case. The exposure, the downstream consequences, the years of legal process ahead. And then she stopped running the numbers because it wasn't her case, and it wasn't her responsibility, and that distinction, she realized, was something new, something she hadn't felt in years. She looked up. Dominic was watching her with the attentiveness she'd stopped being unsettled by sometime in the last several hours. She wasn't sure exactly when. He was very still, the way he was always still, and in the lower light of the corridor his face looked more tired than it had all day. Not exhausted, but weighted. Like the evening had cost him something quiet that he wasn't accounting to her. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking you handled that room better than most people I've brought into one." "That's not what you were thinking." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." He didn't continue. She waited. "I was thinking about Catherine," he said. "She used to say that the worst thing about rooms like that is that the people in them always believe they're the ones doing the watching." He looked at the wall. "She never let anyone in a room like that believe they were watching her." Evelyn held that. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was the best person I knew," he said, without self-pity and without performance. Pure statement. "I don't say that to make you feel a particular way. I say it because you should understand who you're standing in the shadow of, and whether that's something you can manage." The honesty of it landed in a way she hadn't expected. Not because it was harsh, because it was precise. He was warning her. Carefully, genuinely warning her about something real instead of managing her away from it. She thought about shadows. She'd spent 6 years in one she hadn't known she was standing in. The shadow of a deal made between families, a liability disguised as a love story. At least this shadow had a name and a face and spoke to her directly. "I can manage it," she said. He looked at her. "You say that?" "I say it because I mean it." She straightened her shoulders. "I don't need to compete with a dead woman, Dominic. I know who I am." Something in his face shifted. Small, the way all his significant expressions were small. The jaw, the eyes. "I believe you," he said. A door at the end of the corridor opened, and a man came through it moving fast, and Evelyn recognized him in the half-second before he saw them. Richard Ashford. She placed the name from the file she'd encountered. Dominic's first cousin, 2 years younger, a face she knew from photographs and legal documents that had mentioned the family organization in passing. He was good-looking in an aggressive way, dark-haired, a mouth set for confrontation even at rest, and when he saw them both, he stopped. He looked at Evelyn, then at Dominic. His expression did something complicated that settled into blankness. "Didn't know you were bringing her tonight," he said. "You didn't need to know," Dominic said. Richard's eyes went back to Evelyn. He looked her over without bothering to be subtle about it, the specific inventory of a man determining what kind of threat something might represent. "Rough night in there," he said. "Gerald Carter." "I saw." Carter had relationships with 3 of our logistics concerns. Shared port agreements, customs facilitation. Richard kept his voice even, kept his eyes on Dominic, but there was something in his body language, a forward lean, a compression in the chest, that was not as controlled as the voice. "His arrest creates exposure we weren't accounting for." "Then we'll account for it," Dominic said. "It's not that simple. There are—" Richard stopped. He looked at Evelyn again. "This isn't a conversation for mixed company." The phrase, the specific dismissal in it, hit Evelyn in a place she recognized, the same place that had learned to absorb 30 years of being spoken around in rooms that considered her adjacent rather than present. She looked at Richard Ashford and said nothing. Dominic looked at his cousin for 3 seconds. "Evelyn is my wife," he said. "There is no mixed company." Richard's jaw tightened. "Dom, think about what you're doing." "I've thought about it." "You've thought about it for 48 hours, and now Gerald Carter's in handcuffs in the next room, and the timing on this—" He stopped again, breathed, recalibrated. "I need to talk to you, tonight, alone." "Find me at 10, Dominic said. "We'll talk." Richard looked at Evelyn one more time. It wasn't a friendly look. It wasn't hostile, exactly, but it had the quality of a door being evaluated before someone decides whether or not to test its lock. He left back through the door he'd come from. The corridor was quiet again. Evelyn turned it over. The port agreements, the customs facilitation, Carter's arrest creating exposure. She was a legal researcher. She could follow the chain, Carter's financial fraud investigation, touching the logistics arrangements, discovery process potentially surfacing documentation that named the Ashford concerns, federal attorneys whose mandate covered financial crimes potentially having their attention redirected. She looked at Dominic. "Your organization has exposure through Carter," she said. "Potentially. How much?" He looked at her steadily. "Enough to require careful management." "Is that why Richard is worried?" "Richard is always worried. He expresses it as aggression." A beat. "But yes, tonight's development is a complication I hadn't anticipated on this timeline." She felt something solidify in her chest. Not fear, something more structural, the feeling of ground shifting under a building and the building deciding what to do about it. "You told me earlier the timeline had accelerated," she said. "You told me you didn't know." "I didn't know the full scope." "But you knew something was moving." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Dominic, I need to know right now clearly whether I walked into this arrangement with an incomplete picture because you misjudged the situation or because you chose to give me what I needed to agree and nothing more." The corridor was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of moment that had weight. "Both," he said. The single word sat between them like a stone in water. She absorbed it. She did not react immediately. She was too trained for that, too practiced at holding the thing she'd just heard long enough to understand its shape before responding. Both. A man precise enough to know the difference between the two things and honest enough or tactical enough not to collapse them into one. "How much of what happens next involves me?" she said. "That depends on what you know and what you're willing to do with it. I know where federal case filings are cross-referenced, and I know how to read a logistics chain in a financial disclosure document, and I know 3 people in the U.S. Attorney's Office who take my professional calls." She kept her voice even. "I'm telling you that so you understand what's on the table. I'm not telling you I'll use any of it." Dominic looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "Someone might. Not me. But someone in your organization might make a calculation tonight about what a wife who does legal research is actually useful for. And that calculation would be wrong, and I need you to understand that before we leave this building." He straightened off the wall. He came the 2 steps toward her so they were closer, not invading her space, but reducing the distance between them to something that made the next thing he said feel like a commitment rather than a statement. "Anyone in my organization who attempts to leverage your professional access or your knowledge will answer to me," he said, directly. "That is not a category of behavior I permit." She searched his face. "Richard," she said, "Richard is frustrated and he is sometimes reckless, and he is my problem to manage, not yours." He looked at me like I was a liability. "You're not a liability. You're the thing he doesn't know how to account for, which is different." He held her gaze. "That's why he's worried." Evelyn stood in the carpeted alcove of the Alderton Club corridor and understood that the evening had taken a turn she had not fully mapped when she'd sat in that kitchen at 7 in the morning and said yes. She'd understood the social architecture, the re-entry, the visibility, the statement being made about who she was now and who she was walking beside. She'd understood the legal exposure in general terms. She had not fully understood that Carter's arrest tonight would detonate something in the Ashford organization's own structure, and that she would be standing in the middle of it, married, contractually bound, professionally implicated by proximity, and watched by a man who thought she was a door worth testing. She had signed the contract that morning as a woman with nothing left to lose. She understood now, with a coldness that moved through her slowly and completely, that she had been wrong about that. She had things to lose now. New things, unfamiliar shaped but real. Her practice, her access, her name. The reputation she'd spent a decade building in rooms that had barely acknowledged her. All of it suddenly adjacently connected to an organization under potential federal adjacency because of a customs facilitation arrangement with a man currently being walked out of a ballroom in handcuffs. And standing in front of her, a man who had said both and meant it and hadn't looked away. She made a decision, not a large one, not the kind that announces itself. The small, precise kind that changes everything it touches from the inside. "All right," she said. "Tonight we go back in. We finish the reception. We give them exactly as much of this as they need to see, and then we leave." She met his eyes. "And tomorrow morning, you tell me everything. Not the version that gets me to agree to something. Everything. The port agreements, the logistics exposure, the full shape of what Carter's arrest means for the Ashford concerns, and what Richard is actually afraid of." She paused. "And if I find out there's a layer underneath that you're still managing me away from, this contract has an exit clause and I will use it." Dominic looked at her. Something in his expression did the thing she'd seen only once before, at the kitchen counter that morning when she'd laid out her conditions. That small, fractional easing of the jaw that was, she was beginning to understand, the closest he came to being moved. "Agreed," he said. She nodded, smoothed the front of her dress, put her shoulders back. "Then let's go back in," she said, and she walked toward the ballroom door. Behind her, she heard him follow, and she was aware, in the same precise and uncomfortable way she was aware of most things, that she was no longer walking into a room to make a point about Preston Whitmore or Madeline Carter or any of what had happened at St. Sebastian's the day before. She was walking into a room as Evelyn Ashford, wife of the most feared man in Boston, with a federal investigation branching in directions she hadn't anticipated, and a cousin-in-law who had already decided she was a problem, and the paper in her bag that was supposed to be her protection was suddenly looking less like an exit and more like a door she had locked from the inside. They went back into the ballroom and stayed for 47 more minutes. Evelyn counted them. Not on a clock, she didn't look at her watch, but in the particular internal way of someone whose attention is calibrated to duration, because duration is sometimes the only thing standing between composure and its absence. 47 minutes of champagne she didn't drink, and conversation she participated in with the front third of her mind, while the rest of it ran the variables from the corridor, over and over like a file she couldn't close. The room had reconstituted itself around Gerald Carter's absence, the way rooms always reconstitute themselves around the thing that just broke. Carefully, with effort, everyone performing normalcy at slightly higher volume than necessary. The string quartet had resumed. The bar was busy. Two of the Whitmore aunts were laughing at something with the particular bright intensity of women who have decided that laughing is the correct response to a situation they cannot control. Preston did not approach her again. She saw him twice more across the room, once talking to a man she recognized as the Whitmore family attorney, his head bent, his voice low, his posture carrying the specific compression of someone receiving bad news and trying to absorb it standing up. Once standing alone near the window with a glass of something amber, not champagne, looking out at Commonwealth Avenue below, and she had the ungenerous thought that he looked like a man realizing that the thing he'd traded for wasn't what he'd been sold, and she filed the thought and let it go because she didn't have room for satisfaction tonight. Madeline had disappeared from the main floor sometime in the first 20 minutes. Evelyn clocked the absence and did not go looking. At 9:17, she put her hand on Dominic's arm and said, "Now," and he set down his glass and they left. The car was waiting. The night had cleared completely, the rain done, the temperature dropped, the sky over Boston with that washed quality of air that's been scrubbed by weather and hasn't filled back in yet. Evelyn got in the car and let the door close and sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing for the first several minutes of the drive. Dominic didn't fill the silence. She'd noticed this about him. The absence of the particular male anxiety that fills quiet spaces with words to demonstrate comfort with the situation. He was simply present in it, looking out his window, one hand loose on his knee. "Richard will be at the house," she said. "Probably." "Will he be alone?" "No." He looked at her. "He'll bring two of his people. He always does when he thinks a meeting is adversarial." "Is it adversarial?" "That depends on Richard." She thought about the way Richard Ashford had looked at her in that corridor. The inventory, the assessment, the door being evaluated. He's going to make the case that I'm a liability. Tonight. To you. Yes. And you're going to let him make it. I'm going to let him say what he needs to say, Dominic said. There's a difference. She looked out her own window. I want to be in the room. He was quiet for a moment. That's not standard. I'm not a standard situation. She turned from the window. If he's making a case about me, I should be there to hear it. If it's going to affect what happens next, I need to know what's actually being said, not a version you summarize for me afterward. She held his gaze. You said there's no mixed company. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. The estate was lit when they arrived. More lights than the night before. The ground floor windows bright. 2 cars she didn't recognize parked beside the house. Margaret opened the door before they reached it and gave Dominic a look that communicated something Evelyn couldn't read precisely but understood in general register. They're already here and they've been talking. The study. Same room as the night before. Fire, books, the faint smell she'd identified as gun oil. But the configuration was different now. Richard Ashford was standing at the far end, jacket off, sleeves rolled, a glass of water on the table beside him, untouched. 2 men flanked him, positioned with the specific easiness of people who have learned how to stand in a room and look available without looking threatening. They managed it partially. One of them was younger, maybe 30, with a jaw like something architectural. The other was older and still, and watching Evelyn come through the door with an expression she recognized after a moment as professional appraisal. Richard looked at her and then at Dominic. I said alone, Richard said. And I said there's no mixed company, Dominic said, crossing the room to the drinks cabinet. So either make your case in front of my wife or don't make it. Richard's eyes went back to Evelyn. She sat in the chair nearest the door, crossed one leg over the other, and looked at him with the specific attentive blankness she used in depositions. Present, processing, committed to nothing. Fine, Richard said. He turned to Dominic. Carter's arrest puts the Meridian agreements in a discoverable position. If the federal attorneys expand the scope of the investigation, and with 11 counts filed, they will... The customs facilitation contracts come up in discovery inside of 6 months. Our names are on 2 of them. I know, Dominic said. Do you know that Martinez in the New Haven organization has already been contacted by someone in the prosecutor's office? They're building a map. Carter was a node. They're following the connections. Dominic poured 2 fingers of something and didn't pour it for anyone else. When? This week. Marcus told me this afternoon. Richard moved, a short, compressed motion, a man who needed to be moving to think. The Meridian exposure is manageable if we move now. The documentation can be restructured through the Cayman holding before discovery reaches it. It requires 3 signatures and it requires them before business opens Monday. Restructured, Evelyn said. Both Richard's people looked at her. Richard looked at her. That's not your concern, he said. You're describing document restructuring ahead of a federal discovery process, she said. In front of a legal researcher with a signed contract in her bag. So actually it is. Richard looked at Dominic. The look said, You see what I mean. Evelyn, Dominic said. I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it, she said. And I'm not going to pretend I don't know what it means. If you want me to leave the room, say so. She looked at Richard. But don't tell me it's not my concern when I'm sitting in it. Richard set his glass down on the table with a precision that was controlled anger wearing the costume of calm. He looked at his cousin. Dom, he said. I've been with this organization for 14 years. I have never questioned your judgment on personnel. I am questioning it now. This woman has been your wife for approximately 14 hours. She has professional connections to federal legal infrastructure, and she is sitting in a room where we are discussing internal restructuring ahead of a federal investigation. He paused. That is either an extraordinary lapse in judgment, or you trust her more than the situation warrants. Either way, it's a problem. The room was very quiet. Dominic set his own glass down. Tell me something, Richard, he said. He walked toward the center of the room, unhurried, the way he did everything. When you called the meeting tonight, when you came to me at the reception, was that about the Meridian exposure? Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes. Only that? What else would it be about? I'm asking. A beat. Richard looked at the 2 men with him. Something moved between them, quick as a signal. I'm concerned about the organization, Richard said. The exposure, the timing, the choices being made at the top level without full consultation. Without your consultation, Dominic said. I represent a significant portion of the active operation. My input. Your input has been noted consistently over 14 years. Dominic stopped walking. He was in the center of the room now, equidistant from Richard and from Evelyn, and he stood there with his hands at his sides and looked at his cousin with an expression that Evelyn was seeing for the first time. Not the controlled steadiness she'd watched all day, but something beneath it, something with an edge. The Meridian restructuring. Walk me through exactly what you're proposing. Richard did. He was precise about it. She had to give him that. The man had a technical mind and he laid the structure out clearly, the document pathways, the holding entity, the signature requirements and timeline. Evelyn listened with full attention, tracking the architecture of it, and what she heard was not, structurally, the most reckless thing she'd ever encountered in legal research. It was aggressive. It required speed. But the core mechanism wasn't without precedent. What concerned her was the third signature. You said 3 signatures, she said, when Richard finished. He looked at her like he was considering not answering. The Cayman holding requires 3 authorized signatories for structural changes, he said. Who are the 3? Dom, myself. He stopped. And, she said, and the third signatory is currently Gerald Carter. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, the wind had picked up off the coast and was pushing against the windows. Evelyn looked at Dominic. He was already looking at her. His jaw was set, and she could see from where she sat that he had known this before Richard said it, or had worked it out in the car, or possibly had known it for longer than tonight, and had been running the shape of the problem in whatever part of his mind handled unsolvable things. Gerald Carter was in federal custody. A man in federal custody, facing 11 counts of wire fraud and securities fraud and conspiracy, with the full weight of a federal investigation establishing exactly what he knew and who he worked with. That man was not available to sign a restructuring document. And even if he were accessible, any document bearing his signature in the next 72 hours would be radioactive from a legal standpoint, would draw exactly the scrutiny the restructuring was designed to avoid. The window closes Monday, Richard said. Without Carter's signature, it doesn't move. Without the restructuring, the discovery process reaches the Meridian agreements. And when it does, he stopped. His voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before, not fear exactly, but the sound of a man standing at the edge of something he can't calculate. Everything I've built in this organization for 14 years comes into a federal spotlight. Everything. Dominic said nothing. There's another way to handle the signature problem, Richard said. He didn't look at Dominic when he said it. He looked at Evelyn. She felt it then, the full weight of what he was actually in this room to propose. Not just the restructuring, not just the Meridian exposure. He had come here with a map of the situation, and he had triangulated a solution, and the solution had her name somewhere in it, and the look he was giving her now was not the inventory from the corridor. It was a proposition. No, she said. You don't know what I'm going to say. Yes, I do. She kept her voice even and her body still, and she looked at Richard Ashford with the same professional blankness she'd been trained to maintain in rooms with hostile parties. You're going to suggest that my professional access to legal documentation processes, or my ability to speak to certain parties in the federal system, constitutes a resource that could be applied to the Carter situation, in some form, and the answer is no. Richard's jaw hardened. This organization has people in it who— I understand what this organization has in it, she said. I read federal case files. I'm not a child. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward slightly. And I'm telling you clearly, once, so there's no ambiguity later. My professional access is not part of what I brought to this arrangement. It is not available to you, to anyone in this organization, or to this situation. My contract is specific on that point. She paused. And if you attempt to make it available without my agreement, you will find that the person you least want paying careful attention to the Ashford organization's documentation is someone who knows exactly what to look for. The silence after that was a different quality than the ones before it. Richard stared at her. His 2 men were very still. Then Richard looked at Dominic, and the look was cold and final. Get her out of this room, he said. No, Dominic said. Dominic, she stays. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was compressed. The specific compression of a man who raises his voice so rarely that the absence of it carries more weight than volume would. And you listen to me carefully, Richard. What you just asked her, in this room, in front of me, you will not ask again, in any form, through any person. I will not have it discussed, and I will not have it implied. Richard's face did something then, a shift that went through several stages in a few seconds. Evelyn watched it. She had the professional experience to read faces under pressure, and what she saw moving across Richard Ashford's was not the frustration of a man being overruled. It was something older than that. A deeper wound, the kind that means the argument isn't really about the thing it appears to be about. You brought her here in 48 hours, Richard said. His voice had changed, quieter, rougher, the polished surface gone. Without consulting anyone, without... He stopped. Something was working in his throat. Catherine was with us for 9 years before you put a ring on her. 9 years before she sat in rooms like this one. And even then, even after 9 years, there were conversations she wasn't part of. He looked at Evelyn. This woman you've known for 2 days. Richard, Dominic said, I'm not finished. You are, Dominic said. You're finished. The two men looked at each other across the room, and Evelyn sat between them and felt the full history of whatever existed between them. The 14 years and the inherited organization and Catherine's name in Richard's mouth like a weapon he'd been keeping for exactly this. And she thought, this was never only about the Meridian documents. This was about the man at the top making a decision Richard couldn't control, and Richard not being able to tolerate it. Richard picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at Dominic one more time, a look that contained too much to name clearly, grief and anger, and something that might have been, a long time ago, love for a man. He considered a brother, now calcified into something harder and more dangerous. You're making a mistake, Richard said. I've made them before, Dominic said. Richard left. His two men followed. The door of the study closed with a quietness that was worse than if it had slammed. The fire had burned lower. Outside, the wind was still going. Evelyn sat in her chair without moving for a long moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't, the elevated pace of the last 20 minutes trying to resolve itself back to normal. She pressed both feet flat on the floor and breathed. Dominic was at the window, his back to her. His hands not in his pockets, which was new, one hand on the window frame, the other at his side, and there was a tension in his shoulders that she hadn't seen all day. The structure of a man who has just done something that cost him and is standing still enough not to show how much. He's going to do something, she said. Probably. What? Dominic turned from the window. His face was composed, but the tiredness had moved closer to the surface than before, visible now in the set of his eyes and the particular flatness of his mouth. Richard has run the Eastern logistics arm for 6 years. He has his own relationships, his own people, his own agreements that don't come through me. He's been building that independence for a long time. He walked back to the center of the room. Tonight I told him no in front of you. That's not something he'll absorb quietly. Will he go to the federal investigators? The question dropped into the room. Dominic looked at her. You went there fast. It's the obvious play if he wants to neutralize the Meridian exposure on his own terms and remove you from the equation simultaneously. She held his gaze. If he can structure a cooperation agreement with the prosecutor's office, Carter's arrest creates an opening for exactly that. He could potentially reframe his own involvement as peripheral to a larger organization he was attempting to reform from the ins. She paused. And the thing that makes that narrative most credible is a recently married wife who's a legal researcher with federal contacts. It makes you look legitimate, which makes him look like the wronged insider. The room was completely still. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. You worked that out just now, he said. I've been working it out since the corridor. He sat down, not in the chair across from her, on the edge of the desk, which she read as a choice toward proximity rather than formality. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and she could see him running his own numbers, the machine behind the stillness processing at full speed. If Richard moves toward a cooperation agreement, she said, what's your exposure? Depends what he offers them. If he gives them Meridian, it's complicated but manageable with the right legal response. If he gives them the full Eastern operation, his people, his agreements, the relationships he's built that I don't have full visibility on. He stopped, looked at her. It becomes a different situation, How different? Criminal indictment level. The words sat in the room with their full weight. She looked at the fire. She thought about the contract in her bag and its exit clause and the voice in her head that said, "You could walk out the door right now. You've been here less than 24 hours. No one would blame you." And then she thought about what she'd said to Dominic in the corridor. "I know who I am." She thought about whether she'd meant it or performed it. She thought she'd meant it. "All right," she said, "tell me everything you know about the Eastern operation. Every agreement Richard runs, every relationship you have partial visibility on. All of it." Dominic looked at her. "Why?" "Because if he moves toward cooperation, your defense needs to be built on a complete picture of what he can and can't offer. And building that picture is exactly what I do." She met his eyes. "Not for the organization, not as a favor to your family or an asset of your operation. As your wife, who would like to understand what's coming so she can make decisions about her own life with accurate information." She held the gaze. "Is that a distinction you can accept?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. He talked for 2 hours. Margaret brought coffee at some point and set it down without a word and left, and the fire burned down and rebuilt itself from the logs stacked beside the grate, and outside the coastal wind went on doing what coastal wind does. And Dominic laid out the Eastern operation the way she'd asked, systematically, without managing it, with the particular precision of a man who has spent a long time understanding something he's ambivalent about and has made his peace with the ambivalence. She asked questions, sharp, specific, the questions of someone following a legal chain. Which entities, which dates, which names appeared on documentation versus which names operated through verbal agreements, what the Meridian contracts actually said versus what they'd been used to facilitate. He answered all of it. When he didn't know something exactly, he said so, and she marked those gaps because gaps were as important as the information. At 1:30 in the morning, she sat back in her chair with the cold coffee and her mind running at high capacity and said, "Richard has 2 points of exposure he'll use. The Meridian contracts, those are the clean documented link, and a 2019 agreement with a logistics company in Providence that you told me ran through a shell he controls. If he flips on that Providence agreement, he can establish a pattern across multiple jurisdictions." Dominic nodded once. "The Providence agreement, is their documentation on your side?" "In a file I haven't looked at in 4 years." "You need to look at it tomorrow morning, first thing." She paused. "And you need an attorney, not the family attorney. Someone independent, someone with federal criminal defense experience, someone who is not connected to any entity Richard has ever touched." "I know someone," Dominic said. "Call them tonight." He looked at her. The firelight was low and the hour was late, and his face in this light looked older than it had that afternoon. Not old, but lived in, the face of a man who had been carrying a significant amount for a long time, and was, she thought, possibly less alone in doing so than he'd been this morning. "Evelyn," he said. "What?" He said nothing for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something. "Why are you still here?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean you have an exit clause. Tonight gave you sufficient grounds. Richard's proposal alone would have been sufficient grounds. You could have—" "I know what I could have done," she said. "So why didn't you?" She thought about the harbor railing, the gray dress, the way nobody had turned around in the church. She thought about 6 years of building something in good faith that turned out to be someone else's calculated structure, and the particular feeling of discovering that the betrayal was not passionate but strategic, cold, mathematical, a decision made in an office somewhere about the value of one asset versus another. She thought about a man who had said both and meant it, and looked at her while he said it. "Because I decided to," she said. "That's the whole answer." He held her gaze, the sound of a car on the gravel outside. Then another. Dominic's head turned toward the window, a small, sharp motion, the instinctive alertness of a man whose nervous system has been trained to register approaches. He stood. Margaret's voice came from the hallway, not alarmed, but clipped, the voice of someone confirming something she doesn't like. Then a knock on the study door, and Margaret opened it, and she said, "There are 2 men at the gate. They say they're federal agents. They have documentation." The room went very still. Evelyn set down the coffee cup. Dominic turned from the window. He looked at her, and in his face she could see him running the calculation. What this meant, what Richard had done and when, how fast he'd moved, faster than anticipated, which meant he'd made the call before he'd even gotten to the estate tonight, maybe before the reception, maybe before Evelyn had walked back into that ballroom, maybe while they were all still performing normalcy under the chandeliers. "They can wait at the gate," Dominic said to Margaret. "Call Thomas." He looked at Evelyn. "Thomas is the attorney." "Call him," she said. Margaret left. Dominic came back to the center of the room. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with a directness that she was ready for, that she had been, she realized, building herself toward all evening without knowing it. "They're here about the Providence Agreement," he said. "That's my read." "Mine too. If Thomas advises me to cooperate on any element, you listen to Thomas," she said. "That's why you're calling him." He nodded. He reached for his phone. He stopped. "Evelyn." He looked at her, and his voice had a quality in it that was different from everything preceding it, stripped of management, stripped of calculation, something raw at the edges that she thought he probably didn't show often. "What I said earlier, about Catherine, about standing in the shadow of—" "We don't have time for that right now," she said. "I know, Dominic." She stood up. She was 4 feet from him, and she looked at him straight on, the way she'd been looking at things straight on all her life because she didn't know how to do it sideways. "Make the call. The rest can wait." He looked at her for one more second, then he made the call. She stood by the window while he talked to Thomas, brief, precise, the version of Dominic who spoke to people who understood what he was saying without requiring scaffolding. She looked out at the dark grounds, at the line of the coastal road beyond the gate where presumably 2 federal agents were sitting in a car with documentation and patience, and she thought about the shape of what was coming and the shape of what she knew and what she was willing to do with what she knew. The contract in her bag, the exit clause, the professional autonomy paragraph that now ran to 3 pages, the conversation she'd had at the harbor railing less than 36 hours ago with a man she'd decided to trust against every reasonable instruction her life experience had given her. Thomas said he'd be there in 40 minutes. Dominic hung up. He stood in the middle of the study and looked at her across the room and said, "Richard filed a preliminary cooperation inquiry with the U.S. Attorney's Office at 10:47 tonight. Thomas just confirmed it." 10:47, 20 minutes after they'd left the reception. Richard had made the call from the car on the way out of the Alderton Club. "He was always going to do this," Evelyn said. "Tonight just gave him the cover." "Yes." "What does the preliminary inquiry mean in terms of timeline?" "Thomas says 24 to 72 hours before the formal approach. After that, it moves fast." 24 hours. She thought about the Providence file Dominic hadn't looked at in 4 years. She thought about the 11 counts against Gerald Carter and the expanding map of the federal investigation and the way Richard Ashford had looked at her in the corridor of the Alderton Club, the door being tested. She thought about what it meant that he'd moved this fast. Not because he was afraid of Dominic, because he was afraid of her, afraid of what she'd seen in that room tonight, afraid of what she could do with it, afraid that the woman who'd arrived 48 hours ago was going to be harder to dislodge than he'd anticipated when he'd walked into the study, expecting to find a manageable situation, and found instead a woman who had looked at him across a room and said, "Actually, it is." She turned from the window. "The Providence file," she said. "Where is it?" "The filing cabinet in the East office." "Get it," she said, before Thomas arrives. "I need to read it." Dominic looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "Get the file." He held her gaze for one more moment, that fractional jaw ease, that motion she'd learned to read, and then he walked out of the study. She stood alone in the room. The fire was low. The wind was outside. Somewhere at the gate, 2 federal agents were waiting with documentation and the patience of people who understood that the person they'd come for wasn't going anywhere. Evelyn Carter. Evelyn Ashford, she corrected herself, the name still strange in the interior of her own mind, strange and solid at the same time, stood in a stone house by the ocean in the middle of the night, with 40 minutes before an attorney arrived, and 24 hours before a federal process began to move, and a cousin-in-law who had decided she was a problem worth solving through betrayal, and she thought, this is the most complicated situation you have ever been in. And underneath that thought, quieter, surprising her, good. Not good because it was safe, or good because it was fair, or good because any reasonable version of herself from 48 hours ago would have chosen this. Good because she was in it with all of her, Nothing held back, nothing managed. Every skill and every piece of knowledge she'd spent a decade acquiring suddenly not adjacent to the main event, but at the absolute center of it. She heard Dominic's footsteps in the corridor. She put her shoulders back. He came through the door with a manila folder, thick and slightly worn at the corners. And he crossed the room and put it in her hands, and she opened it on the desk and started reading. And the clock on the wall above the fireplace read 1:53 in the morning, and somewhere outside Boston, the Atlantic Ocean went on holding its depth below a surface that gave nothing away, doing what it had always done, waiting for morning. Thomas Riley arrived at 2:34 in the morning in a coat that looked like he'd grabbed it off the wrong hook on the way out, a leather briefcase he'd clearly owned since law school, and the particular wakefulness of a man who had trained himself to be sharp at any hour because his clients didn't have the luxury of convenient crises. He was 61, short, with a gray beard he'd stopped trimming at some point and never resumed, and he looked at Evelyn across the entry hall with an assessment that was quick and professional and landed somewhere around, "This changes things." "Thomas," Dominic said. "My wife, Evelyn, she's a legal researcher. She's been reading the Providence file for the last 40 minutes. Thomas looked at the file in her hands, then at her. "What's your read?" "The 20 agreement is problematic in two specific clauses," she said. "The facilitation language in Section 4 is broad enough that a federal attorney could argue it establishes a pattern of knowing participation rather than arm's-length contracting. And there's a signature on the amendment page that doesn't match the original signatory. Someone initialed over it, and the date is off by 4 months from the main document." Thomas was silent for 2 seconds. Which means if Richard altered that amendment, he was constructing exposure that pointed at Dominic rather than himself. 4 months before he claimed to have discovered the Meridian problem. Thomas set his briefcase on the entry hall table and opened it. "I need coffee," he said to Margaret, who had appeared from the direction of the kitchen. "And a copier." "Study," Margaret said, already turning. "Both." They worked through the night, not glamorously, not in the way that stories sometimes render the working through the night as a montage of intensity and mutual revelation. It was slower and more procedural than that, with long stretches of Thomas on the phone speaking in low, rapid sentences, while Evelyn cross-referenced the Providence file against 2 other agreements. Dominic pulled from the East Office, tracing the amendment signature backward through the document chain the way she traced anything, methodically, without assumption, letting the evidence suggest rather than confirming a hypothesis she'd already formed. Dominic sat at the desk and answered questions when asked and otherwise did not interfere, which she recognized as discipline of a specific kind. He was a man who understood that there were types of problems that required him to step back and trust the people with the right tools, and he did it without making it look like an effort. That was harder than it appeared. At 4:15, Thomas got off a call and looked at Evelyn across the desk. "I have a contact in the Federal Public Corruption Division," he said. "Different department than the Financial Crimes Unit handling Carter. If the Providence Amendment was altered, that's a separate federal issue, obstruction, document fraud. And it creates a jurisdictional split that complicates Richard's cooperation play significantly." He paused. "But to use it, we need to establish chain of custody on the original document, when it left the Ashford filing system and when the alteration would have occurred." "Margaret," Dominic said immediately. Margaret, who had been present at the edge of the room for most of the last 2 hours in the specific way of someone who has attended too many of these nights to be surprised by them, looked up. "The East Office files," Dominic said. "You log everything that comes in and out." "Since 2011, Margaret said. "The Providence Agreement. Who touched it last?" Margaret thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Richard, February 2022. He asked me to pull 6 files for a quarterly review. That was one of them. I logged it out to him and back in 5 days later." Thomas wrote the date down. "That's 4 months before the amended date on the document." The room absorbed that. Evelyn set the file down on the desk and looked at it and thought about Richard Ashford's face when he'd said, "You're making a mistake." The specific quality of that warning. A man who had spent 14 years building a parallel architecture inside an organization that trusted him, constructing a contingency, a version of events in which, if things went wrong, the exposure belonged to someone else. Someone who would be too late to find it. He just misjudged how fast the finding would happen. "He built the exit before the problem existed," she said. Thomas looked at her. He altered the amendment in February 2022, she said. Carter's arrest happened 2 days ago. Richard has been preparing a version of events that insulates him and implicates Dominic for years. The Meridian exposure wasn't a crisis, he discovered. It was a detonator he'd already installed. He was just waiting for a reason to use it. The room was very quiet. Dominic was looking at the file on the desk. His face was still and his jaw was set, and she watched him absorb it. Not the legal shape of it, which Thomas would handle, but the personal shape. 14 years. A cousin he'd brought into the organization when Richard had nowhere else to go. A man who'd sat at the family table and attended Catherine's funeral and stood at Dominic's right side through things she would never have full visibility of. 14 years of building something like loyalty while constructing the exit. She did not say anything consoling. She didn't have the words for it and wouldn't have used them anyway. Consolation wasn't what this moment needed, and Dominic wasn't a man who received it well. She just let him have the 60 seconds it took him to set it down, and then he looked up, and his eyes were clear. "What do we do with it?" he said to Thomas. "We don't do anything with it tonight," Thomas said. "Tonight we document the chain of custody, we secure the original file, and I make one more call to the Public Corruption Division. In the morning, we talk to the federal agents at the gate. They've been there for 3 hours. They can wait another 4. It's better if you don't speak to them at 2 in the morning. It's better if you speak to them at 9 with documentation prepared and an attorney at your elbow and a clear position." Thomas looked at Evelyn. "Your wife's read of that amendment is going to be significant. She should be prepared to give a professional statement on the document analysis." Dominic looked at her. "It's your call," he said. Only that. She'd known this was coming. She'd known it, she thought, from the moment she'd opened the Providence file. Maybe before that. Maybe from the moment she'd chosen to stay in the room when Richard had looked at her like a problem to be managed. The professional autonomy clause in her contract was explicit. What she was being asked to do now fell somewhere in the border territory. Not performing a service for the organization, but providing an analysis of evidence in a process that would affect her own legal circumstances as much as anyone else's. It was the kind of line that didn't have clear edges. She thought about the exit clause. Then she thought about what she'd said at the harbor. The woman who'd gone back to a church she had no business attending, looking for confirmation that she wasn't crazy to feel what she'd felt, and finding something so much more structurally rotten than heartbreak that it had changed the shape of the whole picture. She hadn't been a bystander in that story. She'd been a piece on a board. She was done being a piece. "I'll give the statement," she said. Thomas nodded. He started writing. The clock on the wall read 4:49. At Nini, 12. The following morning, Evelyn sat in the East office across a table from 2 federal agents, a woman named Vasquez, 30s, dark-eyed and precise, and a man named Cho, who took notes and asked occasional clarifying questions with a thoroughness that told her he'd been doing this for a long time. Thomas sat to her right. Dominic was not in the room, which was Thomas's instruction and which Dominic had accepted without discussion. She walked them through the document analysis. She was not performing it. She was not advocating. She was doing what she'd spent a decade doing, presenting a technical analysis of a documentary record with precision and without embellishment, noting where the evidence was clear and where it required inference and marking those distinctions explicitly so there was no confusion about which was which. Vasquez asked 3 sharp questions. Cho asked 2. Evelyn answered all 5 without hedging and without expanding beyond what the document supported. When she finished, Vasquez looked at the file for a moment, then at Evelyn. "You've done this before," Vasquez said. Not a compliment exactly, more like an acknowledgement. "For 12 years, Evelyn said. This document analysis, you're prepared to stand behind this in a formal proceeding?" "Yes." Vasquez looked at Cho. Something passed between them. "We'll need the original file secured with our office," Vasquez said. "Chain of custody documentation, the log record from..." She checked her notes. "Margaret Holt." "Already prepared," Thomas said, and slid a folder across the table. The agents left at 10:40. Thomas sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. "You understand what you just did. I gave a professional analysis of a document. You gave a professional analysis that will likely redirect a federal investigation and significantly complicate the cooperation position of a man who is also my husband's cousin," she said. "Yes." I understand. Thomas looked at her with the particular expression of someone revising a prior assessment. I've represented Dominic for 11 years, he said. I've seen a number of people in and around his life attempt to operate at the intersection of his world and the legitimate one. He paused. You might be the first person I've seen do it without either pretending the intersection doesn't exist or losing themselves in it. She didn't know what to do with that. She thanked him and stood up and went to find Dominic. He was in the kitchen. Same place as yesterday morning, same counter, different light. The April morning coming through the window at a different angle. The ocean out there flat and bright in a way it hadn't been since she'd arrived. He was standing with coffee, not sitting, and he turned when she came in and searched her face. Thomas says it went well, he said. Thomas is cautious about calling things before they're called. But yes, she went to the coffee maker. Richard's cooperation inquiry is going to look significantly different to the U.S. Attorney's Office by end of day. The public corruption referral Thomas filed this morning changes the jurisdictional picture. Richard's attorney will need to restructure the entire cooperation offer, and anything he says about the Meridian agreements will be viewed through the lens of a man who may have been constructing liability for someone else for years. She poured the coffee. It doesn't end his legal exposure. It complicates it enough that the cooperation calculus changes. And my exposure. Thomas is better positioned to assess that now than he was 12 hours ago. She turned. The Providence Amendment was the load-bearing wall of the case against you. Without it, the Meridian agreements are a compliance problem, not a criminal one. There's a difference. Dominic looked at her. Evelyn, he said. She looked back at him. Thank you, he said. Simple and direct and without performance. She held his gaze. You're welcome, she said, equally direct. They stood in the kitchen in the morning light, and it was not comfortable exactly, and it was not easy, but it was real, and she had stopped, sometime in the last 14 hours, needing things to be comfortable or easy as prerequisites for being in them. Richard Ashford retained a criminal defense attorney of his own by noon. His cooperation inquiry was formally complicated by the public corruption referral by 3 in the afternoon. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a statement at 4, indicating that the scope of the Carter investigation was being evaluated in light of new documentary evidence. Language so carefully neutral, it told the people who knew how to read it exactly what it meant. Thomas called at 5. Richard's attorney made contact with my office, he said. They want to talk. When? Tomorrow morning. They're proposing to restructure the cooperation offer to exclude the Meridian materials in exchange for, he paused, in exchange for Richard's withdrawal from the Ashford operational structure. Evelyn was sitting at the desk in the East office where she'd spent most of the afternoon, and she was quiet for a moment. He wants out. He wants out with a clear enough record to move his own assets independently. It's not a terrible deal for him. Is it a deal Dominic should take? It's a deal Dominic should consider carefully with his full attention and without making a decision in the next 20 minutes, Thomas said, which is why I'm calling you first, since you appear to be the person most likely to ensure that happens. She almost smiled. I'll talk to him. She found Dominic in the study. Same room, different hour, the fire going again because the coastal evenings were still cold, even when the days relented. She sat across from him and laid out what Thomas had said without editorializing, and he listened with his eyes on the fire and his hands loose on the armrests. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. 14 years, he said. Yes. He looked at the fire. When Catherine died, Richard was the person who sat in this house with me for 3 days without asking me to perform anything. He just stayed, made sure there was food, handled the calls I couldn't make. He paused. I thought that was who he was. Maybe it was, Evelyn said. People contain both things. He looked at her. A person can sit with you for 3 days in grief and also build an exit for 14 years, she said. One doesn't cancel the other. It just means the picture is more complicated than you wanted it to be. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the steadiness, not the assessment, something more open than either. You're not wrong, he said. I know. She looked at the fire. Take the deal. Not because Richard deserves it, because fighting it costs more than it returns, and you know that. He was quiet. Yes, he said. It took 3 weeks to finalize. 3 weeks of Thomas and attorneys and documentation, and a cooperation restructuring that removed Richard Ashford from the Ashford operational structure in exchange for his non-prosecution on the Meridian matter, contingent on full disclosure of his independent arrangements and the return of assets that had been moved through entities he controlled without Dominic's knowledge. Richard signed. He left Boston. He moved to a city she didn't know and didn't ask about. And the specific gravity of his absence from the organization reorganized itself slowly over the following months into something that started to feel like stability. Gerald Carter pleaded guilty to 7 of the 11 counts in June. His cooperation with the investigation, genuine this time, not strategic, reduced his sentence. The Whitmore family trusts were frozen pending asset review. The process that followed was long and expensive and very much not her problem, which was a feeling she sat with carefully for some time before she trusted it. Preston Whitmore called her once. She saw the number on her phone on a Tuesday in May, 3 months after the wedding, and she stood in her new office. She had found a space in Cambridge, 2nd floor, 3 rooms, good windows because she'd learned to require that. And she looked at his name on the screen and felt what she felt, which was complicated and also smaller than she'd expected. Then she declined the call and put the phone face down on her desk and went back to the brief she'd been drafting. He didn't call again. Madeline wrote her a letter. An actual letter, handwritten, which arrived in mid-July in an envelope with a Somerville return address. Madeline had moved out of the Commonwealth Avenue apartment she'd shared briefly with Preston before his financial situation became too complicated for that particular lifestyle. The handwriting was her sister's, recognizable from birthday cards going back 20 years. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in the Cambridge apartment she'd kept despite everything, Morris asleep on the windowsill, the summer morning coming in through the screens, and read it. It was not a short letter. Madeline wrote about the wedding, not the ceremony but the lead up to it, the months in which the arrangement between the families had been made explicit to her, and she'd understood what it required and had made a choice that she had spent every subsequent day examining. She wrote about Evelyn in those months, about knowing what was happening and saying nothing, about telling herself that the relationship had already been ending on its own, which was the story she'd required to be able to look at her own face in the mirror. She wrote the word sorry 11 times and then wrote, I know that word doesn't do the work I'm trying to make it do, so I'll stop using it and just say, I understood what I was taking and I took it anyway. I have to live with that. She wrote about Preston, about the marriage which had not been simple from the start, not because he was unkind, but because a man who had ended a 6-year relationship for strategic reasons was not a man who'd suddenly discovered the capacity for genuine intimacy. She wrote about the money, the investigation, the months of watching the financial architecture she'd married into collapse level by level. She wrote about the moment she'd understood that she had traded her sister's trust for a life that hadn't been real and was now not even present. She wrote, at the very end, I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not writing to ask you to. I'm writing because you deserve to know that I know exactly what I did, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life pretending otherwise. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and sat with her coffee in the morning, and Morris's indifferent presence on the windowsill, and she thought about Madeline. Not the Madeline of the altar, not the Madeline of 40 feet of chandelier distance in the ballroom, but the sister she'd had before all of it, the one who'd visited for 5 days and been warm in the kitchen and laughed in that room-filling way, and all the history underneath that visit that Evelyn hadn't known she was reading. She didn't forgive her. She also didn't feel the need to. What she felt, sitting with it, was something closer to clarity. The particular release of a debt that no longer needed to be paid because she'd stopped needing the currency. You can't forgive someone and feel vindicated simultaneously. She'd chosen something better than both. She folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer and didn't answer it. Whether she would eventually, she didn't know. That felt like a question for a different morning. The law practice grew. Not quickly. She'd made peace early with the fact that building something genuine takes the time it takes and cannot be compelled by impatience. She took the cases that suited her skills and declined the ones that didn't, and she charged fairly and worked thoroughly, and by the following winter she had 2 associates and a client list that had grown through referral rather than connection, which was the only kind of growth she trusted. She did not take cases connected to the Ashford organization. She did not take cases that came to her through channels she couldn't fully trace. She was careful about this in a way that occasionally required saying no to things she'd have otherwise found interesting, and she accepted that as the cost of the line she'd drawn. Dominic never asked her to move it. Their marriage, The real version of it, the one that emerged from the contract version the way things sometimes emerge from provisional structures when the people inside them stop performing and start being present, developed the way she thought most real things did. In increments, through small revelations, through the accumulation of ordinary moments that turned out not to be ordinary at all on closer examination. She learned that he read history compulsively, not to repeat it, she thought, but to understand the mechanics of how men made decisions under impossible conditions, which was relevant to a life like his in ways that required no explanation. She learned that he went to the kitchen at 5:30 most mornings, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he thought better with the early light. She learned that he had a precise, dry humor that operated so low-key she'd missed it entirely for the first 2 months, and then started catching it, and found that once she started catching it, she couldn't stop. She learned that Catherine Ashford had been, by every account from everyone who spoke of her, genuinely extraordinary, and that Dominic knew this and held it without using it as a wall. That distinction, she came to understand, was the most important thing about him. He was a man who had loved someone well and lost her, and had not allowed the loss to become a reason to stop. She respected that more than she could have articulated. She told him one evening in October when the light was going fast over the ocean, and they were sitting in the study with the fire, and she'd been working on something and suddenly found it not in her to keep working on it, that she had been angrier about Preston than she'd allowed herself to feel at the time. Not the grief anger of heartbreak. She'd felt that, processed it, set it down. The colder, more structural anger of understanding that she had been managed, that someone who claimed to love her had looked at her skills and her access and her name and calculated their liability before he'd calculated their value, that the relationship had been, in some functional sense, a risk assessment. Dominic listened without trying to redirect it. The thing about that kind of betrayal, she said, looking at the fire, is that it's hard to know how much of your anger to aim at him and how much to aim at yourself, for not seeing it. You weren't supposed to see it, Dominic said. That was the design. I know. She looked at her hands. I know that's true, and it still doesn't fully... She stopped. Satisfy, he said. Yes. He looked at the fire. No, he said. It wouldn't, because the thing you actually want is for it to have been different, for him to have been the person he was pretending to be, and knowing his reasons doesn't fix that. She looked at him. No, she said. It doesn't. They sat with that. I didn't tell you everything when I proposed, he said. She waited. I told you I needed a wife for the organization. That was true. I didn't tell you that I'd been aware of who you were for about 6 months before that night. He looked at the fire. I'd read your name on a federal filing related to a case my attorney was monitoring. Your analysis in the document was precise in a way I found difficult not to notice. I had someone find out more. Basic information. Where you worked, your professional record. He paused. When I found out you were connected to the Whitmores, I paid attention. When I found out about the engagement ending, I paid attention differently. She was very still. You knew I'd be at the church, she said. I thought you might be, he said. I didn't know. I was in that part of the city that afternoon for a separate reason. When I saw the car I knew was yours, parked 3 blocks from St. Sebastian's, I told the driver to go to the harbor. She thought about standing at the railing, the coat landing on her shoulders from behind. You waited, she said. I waited. For 20 minutes in the rain. Closer to 30. She held this for a long time. You told me that first night that you watched me at the railing and I didn't ask anyone for anything, she said. Yes. But you'd already decided before that. No, he said. He looked at her then, directly, with the full openness of his attention. I decided there was someone worth approaching. I hadn't decided anything else. He paused. What I watched at the railing, that wasn't the reason I stopped the car. That was the reason I stayed. She held his gaze. She understood the difference. It was a fine distinction, and it mattered enormously. And it was the kind of thing that in another life, in the life she'd been living before April and the rain in the harbor, she might have argued with, might have pulled apart looking for the manipulation in it. She didn't do that. What she did instead was say, Why are you telling me this now? Because I said I wouldn't lie to you, he said. And there's a version of omission that's the same thing. She looked at the fire. The logs had burned to a deep orange, The kind that means the fire is stable and settled and will hold through the night. Outside, the October ocean was dark and restless, doing its seasonal thing, becoming something more serious than it was in summer. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going to tell you that the way I came into your life was clean," he said. "It wasn't. There were calculations involved, and some of them preceded our meeting, and I won't pretend otherwise." He held her gaze. "I will tell you that nothing I've told you since that night has been designed to manage you toward a conclusion I'd already reached. I've said what I've said because it was true, including now." She studied his face. The October light and the firelight made it look like something built to last. The good bones of it, the lived-in quality, the gray at the temples that had grown slightly more than when she'd met him. "I believe you," she said. "Why?" "Because you're telling me something that makes you look worse than you needed to," she said. "People who are managing you toward a conclusion don't do that." He looked at her with an expression that she had finally, 6 months in, found a name for. It wasn't the assessment or the steadiness. It was something quieter than either. The expression of a man who is glad you're in the room, specifically you. In a way that isn't about utility or strategy or what you represent, but about the fact of you in particular. She had not had that before. She hadn't known it was something you could have. She turned back to the fire. "Tell me something," she said. "Going forward, if there are things I should know about the organization, about cases that touch us even tangentially, about anything that affects the terms we agreed to, you'll know," he said, "before it becomes relevant, not after." "Then we're fine," she said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. They sat in the study as the fire held, and the October wind moved around the corners of the stone house, and the ocean went on doing its ancient and impersonal work outside. And it was quiet in the way that quiet becomes when a room has stopped holding its breath. The year turned. She noticed she'd stopped counting days the way she had in the first months. Stopped measuring what she'd agreed to against what she'd imagined she'd agreed to. Stopped doing the continuous low-level audit of whether this was working, whether it was real, whether the ground was as solid as it seemed. The audit was exhausting, and she let it go the way you let go of things that have stopped serving you. Not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, like setting down something heavy you've been carrying long enough that you stopped noticing the weight. The practice had 4 associates by spring. She hired a paralegal named Donna, who had worked in federal prosecution for 15 years and brought a precision to the work that Evelyn recognized and valued. They had an understanding about the kinds of cases they would and wouldn't take, and Donna never asked questions about Evelyn's personal life, and Evelyn respected this as the professional arrangement it was. She saw Madeline once. It was accidental. A Saturday morning in April, 1 year almost to the week from the wedding, in a coffee shop in Somerville near the address on Madeline's letter. Evelyn was there for a client meeting that had ended early. Madeline came through the door in work clothes. Not the polished social armor of the old life, but actual work clothes, paint on the sleeve of her jacket, her hair in a practical knot. She was working in a design studio Evelyn had heard from their mother. Something genuine, something she'd apparently discovered she was good at when the version of herself that had been performing another life fell away. They saw each other at the same moment. The pause between them lasted maybe 4 seconds. Madeline looked like she was preparing for something, bracing. The particular composure of someone who knows an encounter might go badly and is deciding in advance not to fall apart regardless. Evelyn said, "Your sleeve." Madeline looked at the paint. "Occupational hazard," Madeline said. Her voice was careful, waiting. "How's the work?" Evelyn said. A beat. "Good," Madeline said, and then, with something more honest underneath it, "Really good, actually." "I heard that," Evelyn said. "I'm glad." They stood with their coffees in a small coffee shop in Somerville while the April morning moved around outside, and it was not comfortable, and it was not repaired, and it was not the relationship they might have had. But it was real, and it was present, and it was 2 women who had come out of the same wreckage through different sides and were standing in the same room without pretending the wreckage hadn't happened. "Evelyn," Madeline said. "Don't," Evelyn said. "Not here. Not today." She paused. "But not never. Just not today." Madeline looked at her. Her eyes were bright in a way that she was working to manage. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They nodded at each other, and Madeline went to the counter and Evelyn went to the door, and she stepped out into the April morning and stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air and felt the full complexity of it. The grief that didn't go away completely, the anger that had quieted without disappearing, and underneath both of them, something she kept arriving at and not quite naming. She named it now. Relief. Not at what had happened, not at the betrayal or the harbor or the cold equation of what Preston had traded her for, but at what she'd become on the other side of it. The practice. The work she was proud of. The marriage she'd walked into with eyes open and stayed in with eyes open and found something inside that she hadn't designed or anticipated. The woman standing on a Somerville sidewalk who felt the grief and the anger and the relief all at once and didn't need any of them to cancel each other out. She walked to her car. That evening she drove north on the coastal road. She did it sometimes when the week had been heavy. The drive itself was the thing. The familiar road and the April light coming off the water and the turn through the gate and the stone house at the end of it. She parked and went in and found Dominic in the kitchen, which was where she usually found him at this hour. And she sat down at the counter and he looked at her face and poured a cup of coffee and put it in front of her without asking, because he knew by now how she took it and didn't make a production of knowing. "You saw your sister," he said. "How did you know?" "Your face does something," he said. "When something has weight you weren't prepared for." She looked at him across the counter. "How does it look?" she said. "Like you're holding it carefully," he said. "Like you know how to." She looked down at the coffee. Outside, the April evening was going blue at the edges, the ocean doing that specific coastal thing where the sky and water start to match each other at dusk, until you can't quite tell where one ends. She thought about the woman who had stood at a harbor railing 1 year ago in a soaked gray dress, and pressed her hands against the iron and breathed and felt the particular cold of a world that had just finished telling her she wasn't the point. That woman had not been weak. She wanted to be clear about that, inside her own mind, because there was sometimes a version of this story, the version she could feel people wanting to tell about her when they heard pieces of it, in which the harbor was the lowest point and everything after was rescue. That wasn't it. The harbor wasn't the lowest point. The lowest point was the 3 months before it, the slow-managed erasure she'd participated in without knowing because she'd trusted someone who was counting on exactly that. The harbor was where she'd stopped, not been saved. Stopped. Stood still long enough to make a choice. Everything after, the contract, the blue room, the study, the 2 hours of legal analysis at 2 in the morning, the statement to the federal agents, the practice, the marriage, the April morning in Somerville. All of it had come from that stopping, from being the one who decided what happened next. She picked up the coffee cup. Dominic was watching her. Not analyzing, not assessing, just present, the way he was present. The particular quality of attention she'd spent a year learning to receive without flinching. "She's doing better," Evelyn said. "Madeline." "Good," he said. "I don't know what we are yet, she and I." "You don't have to know tonight." "No," she said. "I don't." She looked at him across the kitchen counter, the firelight from the next room catching the edge of his jaw, the gray at his temples, the face she'd studied from every angle over a year of ordinary evenings and still found worth studying. "I didn't understand what I was agreeing to," she said, "when I said yes, in this kitchen." He was quiet, waiting. "I mean that literally," she said. "The legal exposure, the organization, Richard, all of it. I didn't have the information, and you knew I didn't." "Yes," he said. He held her gaze. "But I also—" She stopped, found the sentence. "I also didn't understand what I was agreeing to in the other direction, what it was going to turn out to be." She looked at her hands around the cup. "I thought I was agreeing to a year, something defined and contractual and exitable." She looked back at him. "I didn't understand I was agreeing to this." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sorry?" he said. The question sat in the kitchen in the April evening, simple as a stone, and she held it and turned it and looked at it from every angle she had, and the answer was the same from every angle. "No," she said. He looked at her, that expression she'd named 6 months ago, the one that was about the specific fact of her in particular. "Good," he said. Outside, the Atlantic held its depth below a surface. The evening light was turning copper, and then rose, and then the blue-gray of late April dusk, the colors moving through their cycle the way they did without needing anything from anyone. The ocean doing its old and patient work while on the shore, two people sat in a kitchen with their coffee and the fire going in the next room and the year of everything behind them and whatever came next ahead. The woman who had cried alone under a harbor awning did not exist anymore. She knew this not because the pain was gone. Some of it would always be there, the specific scar tissue of knowing you were expendable to someone who said you weren't, and she'd stopped expecting it to dissolve completely. She knew it because the pain was hers, held in a life that was hers, carried by a person who had built the carrying capacity herself, one decision at a time, starting with the one she'd made when she'd turned away from the railing and walked toward a car in the rain. Not to be saved. To find out what she was made of when she stopped letting other people answer that question. She knew now. She picked up her coffee. The evening came down over the ocean. The house held.